Okay, are we ready? Yay! Welcome to the Brussels to Debate. Please take your seats, and if you don't have one, just stay at the back. We're gonna start right now. There are a couple of seats in front. Hi everyone, welcome to the Brussels to Debate on AI governance and safety. We're gonna start with Gerard de Graaf, the senior envoy from the EU to the US for digital, and the head of the EU office in San Francisco, where you are now. Welcome, everyone. We're very happy to see you again. Gerard, over to you.
Thank you. This will be very showy. My role is just basically to welcome you, but it's just been done. So just the rug has been pulled from under my feet. But welcome, very welcome. I mean, the weather is terrible. This is Brussels to the Bay, and so we try to bring good ideas to the Bay, but now we're also bringing the weather. And I suspect a little bit, because Joanna is just back from Brussels, that she brought this terrible weather, I mean, with her. But I mean, at least it helps us to concentrate. There's no nice views today because of the weather. I mean, it's been, I mean, a very interesting week. I mean, special week. There was the first meeting of the International Network of the Safety, the AI Safety Institutes. There are 10 now and still growing, and we'll hear about like what are the main takeaways. I mean, I just think, I mean, we've been here now as an EU like just over 2 years, and when we arrived, the big topic for discussion wasn't AI at all. I mean, we talked about the metaverse. I mean, the first meetings which we had was all around the metaverse, and then of course, about 2 years now, I mean, 2 years ago, when ChatGPT-3 came and everything changed, and it's been, I mean, I also then in the beginning, of course, lots of discussions like, well, why are you regulating? It's too early, you stifle innovation. And I think the debate has fortunately moved on. And we've seen a lot of like developments and progress over the last 2 years. Of course, I mean, in Europe, we have the EU AI Act in place, and Lucy Sioli, my colleague, is here to talk to you and explain like, well, what we are doing, building up the AI office, etc. But also in this country, we have Senator Josh Becker. I mean, California, I mean, in this state has been very active. I mean, we have the safety institutes. I mean, the academia has been incredibly active on this. So I think we've achieved a lot in 2 years in kind of developing an ecosystem. And of course, there's much more to do, and we'll hear about that. But I mean, that's kind of what we want to get out of this afternoon. There is, because this is a global technology, there's so much need to work in partnership to learn from each other. And if Brussels to the Bay can be a contribution to that, we will be satisfied. And we hope that like at the end of this event, like with previous events, you will think it was worth your while coming here. And with that, I hand over to Anne Flanagan, who's a friend, an Irish kind of, well, national. I mean, we've been working closely with Anne. Anne is the Vice President for AI for the Future of Privacy Forum, and I'll hand it over to you, and the panel will be in very good hands. And thank you, Anne, for taking on this role.
Thank you so much, Gerard. Just checking if people can hear me okay. Okay, super, because I'm mic'd up. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for your time today. It's a pleasure to be here. As Gerard said, I am Anne Flanagan. I'm VP for AI at an organization called the Future of Privacy Forum. We are an organization that is headquartered in DC. I'm here in San Francisco. We also have offices in Brussels, Singapore, and in various parts of the world. And we really look to pull back the curtain on policy, thought leadership, providing assets for stakeholders around tracking legislative developments and the policy ecosystem around AI privacy and data. So great honor to be here today. And of course, I am an Irish national, formerly worked very, very closely with the European Union. So this is a topic that is very close to my heart, and a really, really big week here in California. Such an historic occasion to have that 2-day summit of the AI Safety Institutes. I don't think a year ago that we would have foreseen that would happen. Of course, the Bletchley Declaration is almost a year old at this point in time, and we have seen so much action over that time with the executive order, the standing up of the NIST, AI Safety Institute Consortium here. And of course, in the European Union, the EU AI Act has been passed, and we have the codes of conduct under development. So it's my great pleasure to welcome our highly esteemed panel here today of absolute rock stars. I'm going to go in the order that is closest to me. Starting off, we have Lucilla Sioli. Lucilla is the director of the new EU AI office in the European Commission. Lucilla leads that office and oversees the European AI strategy, AI Act implementation, and international collaboration on trustworthy AI. She also holds dual PhDs in economics and has been a European Commission official for almost 20 years. Next to Lucilla is Daniel Privitera. Daniel is the founder and executive director of the Kira Center, which is an AI policy nonprofit in Berlin. He co-leads the International Scientific Report on Advanced AI Safety and serves as the vice chair for the EU's Technical Risk Mitigation Working Group on the General Purpose AI Code of Practice. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. Next to Daniel, we have Stuart Russell, who is Professor of Computer Science at UC Berkeley. Stuart is a leading AI expert and author of the foundational textbook, Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach. At UC Berkeley, he directs the Center for Human Compatible AI and focuses on the future of AI and its social impact. He's a fellow of the AAAI, ACM, and AAS, and has received numerous accolades, including the OBE and BBC Reef Lectures in 2021. Next to Stuart is Sara. Sara Heck is the head of policy plannings and programs at the AI developer Anthropic. Whoops. It might be this one. It's not an earthquake, right? We're good. What is this? An emergency. It's a flash flood warning. We're all good. There's no earthquake, which is, I think, the main thing we always worry about in San Francisco when we get an alert. Okay, everybody, thank you so much. Well, at least we know our emergency warning system is working, so it's very reassuring. So as I was introducing Sara Heck, who is the head of policy planning and program at Anthropic, is also a foundational operator of Coalition Operators, an early stage venture capital firm. Previously, Sara has led entrepreneurship initiatives at Stripe Atlas, supporting global entrepreneurs in launching and scaling their businesses. Sara also served as the Director for Global Engagement on the National Security Council here in the United States and has held various roles at the US Department of State. Welcome, Sara. And then finally, last but absolutely not least, we have Senator Josh Becker, California State Senator, who is author of the California Artificial Intelligence Transparency Act, CIATA, that many of you may know. Senator Josh Becker represents California's 13th Senate District, covering most of the San Mateo County and northern Santa Clara County. Senator Becker is the main author of 3 AI bills signed into law by Governor Newsom, namely Public Schools Artificial Intelligence Working Group, which was SB 1288, the AI Transparency Act, SB 942, and the Physicians Make Decisions Act, SB 1120. So a round of applause for our panelists. What an amazing group of people that we have here today. And I might add, I understand there's a lot of jet lag on the panel, both from the European Union and also from Asia. So we really, really appreciate your time here today. So kicking off, we've just had this really, really historic week. And I would love to just take, get some takes from the panel of the last 2 days that we just had. Lucilla, I might turn to you first, please. Certainly, as we look at what's been happening over the past year around AI safety, like I mentioned, the EU AI Act, what's happening at NIST, what's happening around the AI safety institutes around the world. Could you talk us through the position that international safety institutes now face to achieve their goals to ensure that AI is deployed in a safe manner for the protection of people and making sure that there are no adverse outcomes?
Thanks a lot for the question, and good morning, everybody. I think the safety institutes are trying to strengthen their capabilities to really be able to evaluate the capabilities of these models, and also being able to see whether there are adequate mitigation measures that can be put in place to mitigate the risk at hand. Now, I think we are probably in very different positions. The science is kind of nascent. Every safety institute is coming from different backgrounds and different stories. So we are slowly building up in terms of capacity, expertise. I can say that for the European Union, we cannot be too slow because, as you said, the AI Act is in force. And maybe differently from the other safety institutes, we are actually a body that is actually a regulator. So we have to enforce the obligations of the AI Act when it comes to the general purpose models, as we call them. You probably call them frontier models or advanced AI models. These obligations are going to be applicable relatively soon. So what we are doing right now in the European Union, for example, is that we are developing a code of practice with stakeholders to be able to identify the risk, identify ways of assessing this risk and the capabilities of the models, and then identifying the adequate mitigation measures that need to be put in place. And the code of practice is ongoing, so it's not finalized yet. But I think this is an important instrument that will help us as direct enforcer of the AI Act in this area, but also the other safety institutes in having, a direction in which to work to develop the technical capabilities to evaluate these models and identify the adequate mitigation measures.
Thank you so much, Lucilla. And I'm super curious. Obviously, the EU has an incredibly strong mandate with the EU AI Act, but that's not the case for every AI safety institute. Could you talk us through some of the mechanisms or some of the dynamics around countries where they have an AI safety institute, but maybe they just don't have that regulatory backing? And of course, we're in an environment, we're here in San Francisco. There's a big AI hype cycle that you'll all be familiar about, a lot of money going into AI, a lot of investment, and a lot of urgency or perceived urgency in the market to launch models really, really quickly. So how is that dynamic playing out?
Well, what I can see, what I can see is that, okay, we have the regulatory power, let's say, that you mentioned. I would say that at the moment, the United States, with the executive order, do have some power, at least in terms of getting information based on the DPA. Other countries don't have these possibilities, but they are relying very much on the willingness of the companies, and some of the companies that are developing models are willing to work with the safety institutes and test certain aspects of the model. So we can see the good willingness on the one hand of the model providers that voluntarily participate to some testing also with the safety institutes that don't have the regulatory power. We will see whether this continues. I hope so, but I think it will be also very important that we align internationally because the models are present globally on markets everywhere in the world, and therefore it is important that at the international level we develop similar standards and similar approaches and similar methodologies. It will also help companies, I believe. Absolutely.
And I'm wondering if anybody else on the panel has views on this, because of course, certainly Daniel and Stuart, you're looking at this a little bit from the outside in, from the academic perspective and the civil society perspective. What do you think needs to happen to ensure that we get that minimum standard coming about where you don't necessarily have a legislative mandate?
Thanks for the question and the invitation. It's great to be here. Yeah, I guess as you were just giving the intro with the Bletchley Declaration being a year, basically a year this time last year, I think it's quite impressive actually what the progress that has been made in terms of first sort of trying to converge internationally, globally on what is actually the case in AI. So I may speak about this from a slightly biased perspective as the lead writer of this international AI safety report. But I think a year ago, just from following the sort of Twitter or X discussions and what was going on in the media, you might have thought it's pretty much impossible for people to even reach some sort of consensus about what is actually going on, what can we expect in AI. And I think we have made pretty impressive progress there. The uncertainty remains, of course, but I think it's at least very valuable to have consensus on there being large uncertainty, because we can then bring that as sort of the scientists and civil society organizations working on this report, for example, we can bring that to the policymakers and tell them, hey, there is very large uncertainty what is going to happen, even in the short term. That is what the report is like one of the main takeaways. And then tell them, we know that's difficult for you, but we're here to tell you, you have to deal with this. And in terms of, international alignment of approaches, regulatory approaches, I think, this week has been an important step in that direction. And I think something that I am particularly curious about and will be watching in the next year is how these different approaches that are emerging, the code of practice that we're working on in the EU, how different legislations are going to align around them. I think that's just a question I'm genuinely uncertain about. Is there going to be some sort of first mover dynamic? I know people in Brussels often talk about the Brussels effect potentially being a thing. Or is there like a second mover thing where maybe the first mover does something and then some things don't work out, but then you learn from that and globally converge to some other thing? I think that is genuinely an open question. I'm obviously quite excited about the code of practice process that we have ongoing now in the EU for the AI Act. I think it's a very promising approach to have this multi-stakeholder. So for those who don't know, it's a very multi-stakeholder approach with close to 1,000 stakeholders being involved, a very diverse set of stakeholders, not just European stakeholders, of course, but also non-EU companies and organizations. And it's this iterative process with different drafts and different rounds of input and workshops and sessions. And, with my civil society hat on, I think that is a very commendable approach, especially given all the uncertainty and how fast AI is moving to try and come up with this, under time pressure, to come up with this inclusive approach. So I think if this goes well, it can produce something very, very impactful and very useful. Let's see, and let's hope for the best. I don't know, Stuart, if you have extra thoughts.
So I definitely concur that the rate of change has been remarkable. From March of 2023 until now, so a year and a half, we've had multiple international summits. We've had all kinds of bodies being stood up. Obviously, the European Union AI Act was already in process, dating back several years. And I'm seeing among the companies a emerging consensus on an overall framework of how they're going to manage the risks in their development process and in the products that they put out. And the devil is in the details. So Daniel refers to this consultative process with all of these stakeholders, but historically it tends to be the companies that can afford to pay someone full-time to go and sit in endless committee meetings and read endless drafts and write endless drafts. And the people from civil society who are doing it unpaid in their spare time are at a significant disadvantage. And I don't think we should underestimate the ability of the industry to ensure that any regulation that does emerge has little to no effect on their freedom to run their businesses as they wish. I also think I just want to point to some unfortunate facts about the technology. So in the beginning, AI, in the 50s and 60s, there was very little theory. People just sort of wrote programs and said, oh, wow, look at this cool thing that it does. And we called that the look ma, no hands era, right? It's like a little kid showing their mom that they can ride a bicycle without holding the handlebars, right? And then, sometime in the early 70s or so, we got a lot more rigor, and that grew cumulatively to the point where in the early 2000s, this was a very deep, respectable technological field with great mathematical foundations and engineering artifacts that did what we expected them to do because we designed them to do it. And now we're back in the look ma, no hands era, right? And it's just an accident that a particular approach to making AI systems do cool things turned out to be scalable. And in particular, it was able to, that approach, building language models, was able to take advantage of the fact that humans have, in some sense, done thousands of years of labeling work, right, by writing, right? So when you write, you are saying, well, this is the next word that's going to happen, right? You're saying that's the next word. You're providing the label for that next word prediction problem. And so this approach of building language models was able to tap into that enormous resource that hadn't been used before, and is creating both opportunities and enormous risks. If you believe some of the experts in the companies and their CEOs, we will have AGI by 2026 or by the end of this decade, and we have no solution to the control problem. And that's the worst possible situation that we could be in.
So I think we've heard the doomsday scenario. Well, I think one of the interesting things, and it's been fascinating for me as a former policymaker myself, is to see how policymaking has changed in this space. So I think back in the day, there was a lot more regulation went out and companies responded to it. There seems to be much more consultation right now. And it's very interesting. I think the last couple of days here in San Francisco, there was a program where there was a lot of engagement with the model developers. And then, of course, between the safety institutes themselves. And I think that Stuart brings up an excellent point around LLMs, in the sense that I think when we think of AI right now in 2024, our minds go straight to LLMs. But of course, AI is a bigger, a wider area than that. I just might go back to Daniel, because you mentioned the codes of practice. And I think a lot of people in the room will be familiar with them, but there may be some in the room or online who are not necessarily so familiar with them. Would you be able to outline for us the different areas that what the codes of practice are, first of all, and then what they're designed to achieve across different areas?
Yeah. So the AI Act is the big landmark EU AI legislation that got passed after lively discussions and debates at the end or at the start of this year. And it's obviously a very high-level legal text. And the Code of Practice is the document that will detail out what exactly the requirements are that follow from this high-level text, specifically for developers of general-purpose AI, which, yeah, basically GPT for kind of AI. And then there's a distinction there between general-purpose AI models generally and general-purpose AI models with systemic risks based on a compute threshold and potentially other criteria, which hopefully will get updated very frequently over time. And the Code of Practice is divided into 4 areas. And so again, these are sort of the requirements for developers of general purpose AI like Anthropic and other companies. The first area is sort of copyright and transparency. The second is assessment of systemic risk, basically large-scale societal risk. The third area is mitigation measures for such large-scale risk. And the fourth is internal risk management and governance. Yeah, and so the aim is to have by May 2025 to have this document finalized, and I think it will come into effect in August 2025.
I think we're looking at spring, right, Lucilla? You're the real expert on this.
Yeah, I mean, the code of practice is developed by the community, meaning we have the participation is from the model providers, the civil society organization, academia. It's managed by chairs, and Daniel is one of the people who are helping the chairs to manage the different working groups. At the end, the commission has to endorse this code of conduct. So we have to endorse, and of course, we have an interest that there are companies that sign up to it, because if companies may decide not to follow it, and they will have to respect the obligations in the Artificial Intelligence Act in other ways. So we have an interest in making sure that companies are interested in signing up to the code, but the code has to be sufficiently, let me say, responsible for us, European Commission, to endorse it and present it as a very important tool for compliance to the AI Act.
Absolutely, and of course, the EU is obviously a leader in this space, and NIST is doing great work as well. I want to switch gear a little bit and bring Sara and the Senator into the conversation around, so obviously we've heard what the European Union is doing. What do we think the chances are for, I guess, international cooperation in this area? Obviously, we've had the AI Safety Institutes have met this week, but when it comes to actually making that interoperation work, you need common standards, common testing methodologies, and of course, we're entering into an era as well of a new administration. So a lot going on in terms of the international dynamics at the moment. So Sara and the Senator, I'd love to hear from you both on this interesting area that I'm sure lots of people in the room have questions on.
Great. Well, I can't be, I'm not an oracle and able to see exactly what I think is coming, but I think it's an important question. And I think the reality is we have a lot of gratitude for the work that the EU has done, because they really are out front. And I agree with you that it's sort of yet to be seen if that is the standard, or we sort of reform the standard based on what it is. But my gut is that it will at least be the floor, and people will sort of look to it as an incredibly important artifact over the arc of time of regulation. So I will say that. I think international standardization is really important. Earlier this week, we sort of quietly launched what we're calling our voluntary commitments hub, because we have signed up to 8 sets of commitments in the past 15 months that total 72 commitments that we report on now. And that is not to say that those commitments are not each of them individually important, but what we did in this hub is sort of consolidate them and say, hey, all of us are saying a lot of the same things, and we are creating an industry standard around this. And it is not a good use of time for us all to be individually reporting on all these things. I would much rather be spending that time and headcount and money supporting AISIs, supporting our individual evaluation efforts, doing the things that are really going to advance the safety, security, and optimistic uses of AI, than just doing sort of a perfunctory, reporting exercise. So I think there's definitely a balance of where this is going. I think we do see some standardization. I think the more that we talk through summits like what happened this week, and we have that collaboration, tight collaboration, particularly with technical people between industry, academia, and government, the more we will start to see sort of very incremental standard setting that doesn't always have to be sort of a big announcement from a major government, but sort of everybody understanding, okay, these are the evaluations we should be doing. This is who's doing them best. We can all meet that standard. Great. Now let's move to the next thing, because there's just so much work to be done in this space. And so I think these collaborative efforts, and not necessarily duplicating them, is really where we need to go.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I can just add to that in the sense that, first of all, my thanks for including myself in California. Most of Irene's one of our advisors here to the state Senate here as well, and so from my team there in the back. And certainly in this area, in climate legislation, other areas, we're trying to look at how can we collaborate. And in California, we're part of the rest of the country, but sometimes we feel that we need to lead in areas, and certainly this is one where we've been pretty aggressive and thoughtful. We had probably had 50 AI bills that were in the legislature this year. Only some of them made it through all the way, and I'll talk about some of the bills that I did later. But certainly, we sort of grapple with the safety question. That's still an ongoing piece. But in all that, we looked at the EU, look what the EU is doing, and agree that certainly it's best if we can kind of come up with some international standards, and if we can have that kind of collaboration going forward. As it pertains to the broader U.S. policy, we will have to see. There's some guy named Elon, or something. Elon, is that his name? He thinks his name, but he's involved now at some level. That could play in various ways, right? Been an advocate of safety, but also has companies in the space. So, we're going to be watching closely what happens at the federal level. But from a California standpoint, I think you can continue to see more aggressive action this year, and certainly collaboration.
Absolutely. And I have a bit of a wild card question here. So we've had this amazing meeting this week, and I hear there are 10 safety institutes and counting. Anyone want to give their hot take? It probably is a very hot take. What if we threw China in the mix? How would that change dynamics?
I don't want to be holding the mic right now for this hot take question.
Great.
Yeah, so we've actually been holding informal meetings with leading Chinese AI researchers, and they've been extremely constructive. China has actually regulated AI more strictly than the EU. So the narrative that you hear in the US is, well, we can't regulate because the Chinese will just go ahead with no regulation. And so the US shouldn't regulate because that will put us behind in the competition. It's a fictional narrative based on false premises. Now, you could argue that, well, perhaps the Chinese military academic complex is going to do it in secret, and that's all possible. But the regulations they have on their AI industry are quite significant. I've spoken to people who are still going through the approval process. To have a large language model, you have to show that it supports a socialist worldview. Would you like to have that as one of your evaluation tests? Right? I mean, it's quite, and in the initial regulation was that it has to output true and accurate information. Would you like to have that as one of your tests, right? And that was the one actually that the companies in China pushed back against, and they convinced the government to relax that regulation because they had no way of meeting it. But it's still very difficult. And what I hear is a lot of Chinese companies, as a result, are focusing more on B2B applications and not public-facing large language models. The approach that we've discussed in these meetings with the Chinese experts, we call it behavioral red lines. So it means obviously unacceptable behaviors, such as AI systems replicating themselves or breaking into other computer systems or aiding people in the development of biological weapons and so on. So some of the companies in the US are concerned about similar kinds of unacceptable behaviors. But the important point would be that you have ex ante regulation, that until you can show to the satisfaction of the regulator that your system is not going to exhibit those behaviors, you don't have access to the market. And this is how we regulate medicines, for example. You don't get to sell medicines until you convince the regulator that your medicine is not going to kill people. Right? And it's as simple as that. That's how we have buildings, right? You can't go into a building until they've inspected it to make sure it complies with the building codes. And they do that at every stage of construction as well. So we regulate vast areas of our economy this way. And eventually, given the potential for extreme risk, it's inevitable that we will have regulation of that type for AI systems. It's inevitable. So you can try to delay that inevitable stage. You can wait for a Chernobyl scale event to happen, or you can accept that it's going to happen and start working on it now. And I think China is willing to do that. This agreement has gone up, and you obviously, if you're a Chinese scientist, you can't sign a public statement on this kind of policy without higher approval, and it has gone up the chain and down, and that's what they're willing to agree to.
I guess that is an interesting point, is that how these concepts actually get operationalized can vary, of course, from country to country. I think given the AI Safety Summit that we just had, and of course we're trying to move towards international cooperation, Sara, is there a role that companies can play in this regard to help oil the wheels and ensure that AI is developed responsibly around the globe?
I mean, I think so. We think so at Anthropic. We are a company whose mission is to ensure safe and secure AI going forward. We pioneered the responsible scaling policy that now many of the industry players have the same or very similar policies. So I think there is clearly a role for regulation, but I also think that particularly in the US context, we have seen lots of examples where industries can self-regulate and do the right thing. And I think that AI will be hopefully an extreme version of that. So, we do our best to be at the frontier of those sorts of evaluations, to work with people in government, to work with people in civil society, to work with academics, so that we can safely advance the technology in ways that we perhaps haven't safely advanced other technologies that have come forward. So, I will not predict where we are on regulation in even 15 years, because I think this will move very quickly. But I can tell you that we're not going to wait for regulation to do the right thing.
That's obviously positive to hear. And I think, Stuart, you mentioned there ex ante regulation. I think it's interesting to see how you get this combination of ex ante and ex post regulation around AI. The Office of Management and Budget, for those of you that may or may not be aware, that manages in the White House how the US government procures AI. They have issued some pretty strict guidelines around standards that they want to see in the AI that they procure, because they don't develop their own. So it's a very, very interesting moment. Lucilla, I'm gonna head back to you. And just on this topic of regulation, AI is such a complicated space, so much data, these gigantic algorithms. Sometimes the companies themselves may not immediately know what the technology itself is doing. How can regulators tackle this space, given the fact that it can be challenging to get information from companies about how different models work, and in terms of being able to understand how the technology works, to then make the decision on how to regulate that technology? I think that was a standing point of debate over the last couple of years as we saw the EU AI Act negotiated. Now that is in place, now that we have this regulation in place, the regulators will continue to face that challenge as they start to enforce the EU AI Act. What are some of the solutions that can be drawn on?
So I think that the regulator has the need to technically equip itself. So we in the European AI Office, for example, we are recruiting a number of technology specialists and data scientists that have PhDs, that know evaluation, that have been working in this field. And, and certainly we have to strengthen our capabilities here. Obviously, companies will always have greater experience than what we can have in the public office. They simply have more people. They know maybe how the model works, or at least the basics of those models and the parameters they use and the weights and everything. And there is an asymmetry of information there, which is obviously important. However, I think that it is, companies will first of all have to put in place in measures of internal risk management, internal governance, that will make sure that also internally there is, exactly because there are so many experts and there is so much knowledge about the model, there are processes in place that allow some almost independent testing. It can never be completely independent, and that's why you need a regulator. But that some of this kind of testing can actually take place inside the company itself, have a close dialogue with the regulator to understand also the evolution of technology. And the regulator has to work, for example, with independent experts, for example, academics, who can help government in upgrading their technical knowledge, in identifying maybe technical elements that the government itself was not aware of. In fact, in the EU, we are setting up a so-called scientific panel that we will be calling for in the next couple of months. And there we want to have a pool of independent experts that come from the scientific world, who can flag to us, European AI Office, if they observe new risk, if they observe new capabilities, if they see elements in the market that we're looking at that the office didn't catch. So they have the possibility to flag this to us, and we will have the task of investigating this problem if it is flagged to us by a majority of this scientific panel. So we have tried to put in place a number of guardrails about our technical capabilities. As I said, government will always have less, maybe, capabilities than the companies, of course. But there are ways, I think, of always, putting ourselves in a context where we can actually try to mitigate or help mitigating the risk that may arise. And I think that also, at the end, a continued dialogue with the companies will also be essential.
Thank you so much. I'm going to switch all the way to the other side of our panel to Senator Becker. California has taken a different approach to this, but I think some of the same goals. I know that you yourself have championed legislation around transparency. Of course, you mentioned earlier on so many bills that we had on the table. I know you yourself with SB 942. Could you take us through how California is addressing this challenge, of course, as the center of a lot of the AI development right now that we're seeing right across the world?
Sure. Well, we have 80 members of the state assembly and 40 members of the state senate. So you kind of have 120 political entrepreneurs in some sense. In our system, everyone can introduce their own bills. And so that's what really had, so many. And then you kind of go through the process and see. So we had bills around model transparency from Assemblywoman Jackie Irwin, and safety bills, which we discussed, and then bills in other areas around high-risk decisions, and then a lot of focus on transparency as well. So I passed a bill, the AI Transparency Act, that really does two things. So it requires either manifest or latent disclosures, but also requires the AI companies, large AI companies, to have an AI detection tool and to have an API for that AI detection tool, so that somebody then could, if they want to, create a site that then could check across the large AI companies. So really try to create more of a one-stop shop rather than having to go to each company and say, hey, was this created by your, on your platform? So I think that AI, that sort of API piece and the AI detection tool is pretty unique and something we're quite proud of. And so but because I think we're all struggling with that question, right? Was something created by AI? And we're all concerned about, we're very concerned with this election, but also now, of course, for future elections, how are we going to be able to tell in the future, was something created by AI or not? And then, of course, we have not just images, but we're going to deal with audio and video and all of that going forward. So that was one big focus, was transparency. One thing was also able to get past was look at certain sectors, like, again, education's right now, let's imagine being a school teacher or a student right now, and you're trying to think, are my students using AI for this paper? And maybe in some cases it's fine. You say, hey, that's okay. We encourage this, for this part, great. And maybe there's some positive uses of AI in the school that we want to get more widely adopted. We have teachers who say they don't want to, they don't want their kids using it. They don't want their students using it. And how do they tell, right? What is the technology out there to try to stay in front of it? So that's why I really went with a working group approach on that issue. And then in medical, we see lots of positive uses of AI in terms of drug discovery. And I think people see that as one of the real positive areas where we could save a year or two off and billions of dollars off the discovery of new medicines. But at the same time, here in the US, this is probably a hard concept for you to grasp, because we're the only country in the world really that has this kind of medical denial. So people actually, doctors say, hey, we think this treatment is warranted. And the insurance company says, no, actually it's not. We're not going to approve it. So I know it's a foreign concept, and it's a bizarre concept, I'm sure, for those of you not from here. But it's an unfortunate part of our medical system. Actually, over 40 million denials last year, and so the bill that I passed is specifically called Physicians Make Decisions, so that that insurance companies are not using AI and algorithms to deny care to folks who might need it, so that at least physicians make that final decision. So again, I know it's a foreign concept for you all to grasp, but something that we deal with here. So we're successful in passing bills in some specific areas as well, where you might see emerging problems coming up from over reliance on algorithms and such. So I think this year, again, we're going to certainly see more bills on these topics, and we'll look forward to this collaboration and learning with industry, as well as with the EU going forward.
Absolutely, and so curious. I think it's an important point that even though we've been talking about international cooperation between countries, in the United States, the states have an outsized impact in legislation in this area. Do you think things are going to change now going into 2025 with the shift in administration? I know there has been a lot of talk about, will the existing EO be wound down? Will the work that NIST is doing change? Will the states become more aggressive or less? Will things remain largely the same, but just have a different branding, let's say? Would love any opinions that you have, Senator.
I think that, in this area, as well as an area like climate, that states become even more important. And leading edge climate states being able to work together, that's something I've worked on now for a number of years, but also in this area as well, right? How do you have leading states that want to work together? So I just got news as I was over here that Washington State is working on a bill similar to my Transparency Act bill. There's a group called the AI Transparency Coalition. So they actually kind of testified to my bill, and now they're going to do a similar bill in Washington State. So I think we can see that kind of work happening. And, with my transparency bill, it's any company that has more than 1 million users a month. So any large company that is doing business in California that has has that kind of users generally would be so. And if they're going to do something for California, they'll do it more broadly as well. So I think that you will see states to have a more outside impact going forward.
Thank you so much. And Sara, Anthropic was one of the companies that was very public in its support of SB 1047, one of the most famous bills, which actually did not get through California. But Sara, would love your perspective on the role of California right now in this environment.
I will say we supported many aspects of SB 1047. But again, I think we we were very committed to setting the standard, particularly on what the European Union is calling safety and security frameworks, what we call our responsible scaling policy. We think that this is very practical and a very practical and pragmatic approach to legislation and regulation. And I think there were aspects of SB 1047 that really sort of met the moment, especially in the sort of amended version of it. And so, we'll see what you all do in the next legislative session and sort of what is going on across the United States, especially given the new administration. We'll see. I think this actually sort of goes back to your first question that you asked me about internationalization. I mean, I think the reality is we don't want a patchwork of regulation that just ties everybody up and doesn't have them focus on the right things. And so I'm not saying do or don't do state legislation. I'm saying let's do things that are practical, come together, make sure that they're aligned. And when there shouldn't be alignment, let's have those tough discussions, because I think it's really important and context really matters. And so again, we're not going to have a global regulation on AI for sure. But I do think that it's important that we sort of don't politicize AI regulation to the point where it's actually not pragmatic and not getting us all to the outcomes that we want to see.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I know it's getting a little warm in the room. Everybody feel free to get some water. We have about 10 or 15 minutes more with our panel, and then get ready because we're going to hand over to you. So have your questions ready. That goes for the folks that are tuning into us online this afternoon here as well. I want to turn to, we've been talking about, regulation. I think we probably haven't discussed why we might need regulation. What are the risks around AI? And I know that Stuart has mentioned some of the catastrophic risks. I'd be interested from Daniel's perspective of some of the more, I guess, immediate risks that we might perceive. But Stuart, you've stressed obviously the danger of some of the catastrophic risks of powerful models. What do you think the world should be doing when we're looking at safety standards to actually avert these risks, or at least minimize the chance of them happening?
So I think it's probably necessary to have a combination of technological progress and regulation. Just to put a sort of order of magnitude on it, the companies that are advancing AI have resources about 1,000 times greater than all the organizations working on safety. So if there is going to be that technological progress, it has to happen within the companies. And regulation can make that happen. So Lucilla mentioned earlier this idea that there's a division of responsibilities between what the regulator does and what the providers do. In most areas of high-risk technologies, for example, if you look at medicine, how many people are working on clinical trials? Hundreds of thousands of people altogether across all the pharmaceutical companies, and then the research groups that they fund in universities and hospitals and so on. They're not working for the regulator. Regulator does not run clinical trials, does not test medicines. The responsibility of the provider is to do all of that, provide the evidence to the regulator, and the regulator still needs expertise to understand, were these trials conducted properly, and is this evidence sufficiently convincing? And sometimes there are arguments where it's not clear one way or the other, and that's okay. And so for medicines, the evidence is based on randomized clinical trials, which give you a clear connection between what is the evidence being provided and what is the thing that the regulator, and in some sense the public, and the regulator is really representing the public in this case, can a member of the public take this medicine and not die? That's what they care about. And you need a logical connection between the evidence and the decisions that people are making around the technology. And so for nuclear power, the regulator wanted to know, if we put a nuclear power station near this city, what's the chance that it's going to blow up and release all of its radioactive material? And until the provider can calculate that probability, the regulator says, well, sorry, we don't care that you have clever people. We don't care that they spent 2 weeks red teaming the nuclear power station design. We want to know that probability because without that, we cannot decide if it's safe enough to put near one of our cities or near one of our rivers, our water supplies, whatever. And so the separation here is the government, the regulator, decides what assurances do we need, period. Not what assurances can the provider generate. And if the provider can't generate those assurances, the regulator is obliged to say, come back when you can. And this is the only way that we're going to avoid these catastrophic risks. If we say, well, okay, yeah, I know you can't, it's very difficult, you don't really understand how these large language models work, it's very difficult for you to provide any kind of assurance or any kind of analysis of what it's going to do, so fine, just go ahead, right? We wouldn't accept that for a nuclear power station if the provider said, well, we don't know how to calculate the risk of meltdown. We would say, well, come back when you can, right? And come back when the risk is small enough. And so we have to do it both ways. There are technological approaches to building AI that I think would be much easier in the sense that you could analyze what the system is going to do, how it's going to behave, and provide either a statistical or a logical guarantee that it will not exhibit certain kinds of behaviors. I think it's really hard to do. I would not want to be in the position of a company that spent $100 billion developing a large language model and then be asked to provide some assurance that it's not going to do X, Y, or Z, because I would not know how to do it. But that doesn't mean the regulators should say, okay, then fine. I think that separation is really important to maintain.
Very, very clear message there of the role that of the private sector, that the public sector don't necessarily have all the answers. Thank you for that take. Daniel, I guess you're wearing two hats here today. In terms of, I guess, both the code of practice and then sort of how you see the role of civil society in terms of helping to illuminate and identify some of those risks. I think one of the things that we do at the Future Privacy Forum, we really seek to provide information and research about how to protect people. What is your take on this, Daniel?
Yeah, interesting. When you announced earlier, you were going to ask about catastrophic risks first, and then sort of about more, I guess, risks that are already have materialized. And I think it's related to how you've phrased it now. I've been thinking about this like division that comes up often in the discourse, these risks or those risks, and then, it's always the ranking of like which one is more important. Yeah, and I think a more useful way to me is to think about these as being on a spectrum and being not, so different in a lot of ways. I was thinking about one of the risks that have materialized is CSAM-related child sexual abuse material. And I think there are actually some features that these all have in common. So these new CSAM risks, for instance, they have emerged pretty quickly as at least a specific kind of those risks, as these models have been getting more capable in a pretty short amount of time. And we're basically, or policymakers are now facing the situation that they have to somehow deal with this new risk that we're still trying to grapple with and understand better, but it's already affecting people. And so that's one challenge for policymakers. At the same time, there's this huge uncertainty about the speed of progress in the next years, as Stuart said earlier, or even months. and it could be very fast. And so I think that's just always going to be the theme, probably, or like an important theme for policymaking going forward, how to deal with this potential speed and not always having all the evidence available that you would want to have, or that you are used to having in other industries, in other safety relevant industries. And then I guess, yeah, the question is, at what point as a policymaker do you say, wait, stop, even though we don't have, all available evidence for a specific risk maybe being a thing, we just don't feel enough with this, and we maybe want some evidence on the contrary that there is that this is safe enough, or until we have more evidence, we don't feel comfortable making this extra step in terms of capabilities. And then at the same time, of course, with this limited evidence, there's also the other risk of over-indexing on maybe some emerging evidence of a potential risk, and then you regulate, and it turns out to be sort of not necessary, or maybe not very effective and too burdensome. So in that sense, I have a lot of respect for the position that policymakers are in with this, because the stakes are already very high, and they're going to get even higher. Yeah, and I think thinking very hard about this question of evidence and where should the onus lie for that, that is going to be a question that will become ever more important for policymakers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you were referring there to synthetic content and just the absolute proliferation of people talk about deepfakes. FPF we had a report there a few weeks ago, authored by my colleague Jameson Spivak, that looked at synthetic content, the rise of synthetic CSAM, like you mentioned, the rise of synthetic non-consensual imagery, and certain things that mitigation measures. And it's very interesting to hear a common theme, I think, amongst all of the panelists, that there is a role for both the public sector and the private sector, and nobody can get this right by themselves. I'm going to ask one last question of all of the panelists here this afternoon, and then I'm going to invite in our esteemed audience to contribute to the conversation. Lucilla, I know you're hanging in there with the jet lag, so I'm going to start with you. It is AI Safety Institute Week, if you will, given that we're here in San Francisco, and of course there will be a Paris summit next year. The areas that they're looking at right now around standards, of course, in the European Union, you have different cultural norms, you have fundamental rights. Is there a need, do you think, for additional cooperation beyond the AI Safety Institutes around AI and around how AI affects people? Do we think that there is room for more? Are you aware of other mechanisms that are being set up?
Well, there is room, because artificial intelligence is not only the generative AI models we've been speaking about until now. So in the AI Act, we dedicate an important part of the AI Act to the normal artificial intelligence, which can be risky from the point of view of violation of fundamental rights and safety if used in certain contexts. So there are certain applications, for example, that we even prohibit in the European Union, and others for which we require that there is an ex-ante conformity assessment before they are put on the European market. So on this part of the regulation, we have some bilateral discussion with some non-European countries that are introducing legislation which follows similar lines. For example, Brazil is preparing a legislation in this sense. Canada, now let's see what happens also with their government, but they have prepared a bill in that sense. And so this is another area where we need to have international collaboration, where we don't have, a network of safety institutes. In this case, it's a different approach, and maybe it is probably simpler also to implement relative to the very large advanced models, simply because these are much more new. And as it was said, I mean, the science is nascent, and so sometimes it's difficult to anticipate the risk as well. It's difficult to mitigate them. But I also wanted to draw, maybe I should have said this earlier. I think that one part of the response to the problem of having to advance this science is also that we have to involve as many experts as possible. So earlier I mentioned academia, but for example, there are also organizations, technical organizations, even private sometimes, or sometimes non-profit, but outside academia, which are specializing themselves in testing and evaluating certain aspects of these models. And so I think that also the role that these kind of organizations can play will be important. And so another important part for policy making is actually to try to nourish a little bit this market and have more of these organizations emerge, exactly because we are working in this particular area, and they can represent, if they can be trusted, they can represent important sources of third-party assessment that can help governments and can help companies in becoming more responsible.
Thank you so much, Lucilla. Dan?
Yeah, I don't know, give it to you.
What's that?
Your take.
Oh, on the same question?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Wait, and what was the question again? I was just like immersed in listening to Lucy.
we can hopscotch around the panel about international cooperation on AI beyond the, I guess, I'm reticent to use the word just the AI safety institutes because they're doing phenomenal work, but other scope for cooperation around maybe values or rights or other areas.
Well, yeah, I wish I knew the answer. And I'm particularly curious for Sarah's take, because I didn't hear exactly what you said earlier, whether you said there won't be global regulation or there will at some point be. But anyways, I think the interesting, I think we're seeing some steps with the Global Digital Compact to at least like slowly move in that direction. Of course, yeah, the pace is a different one. And at the UN level. I mean, ultimately, I have a pretty strong intuition that we want that and it will be needed. And also that it's possible, yeah, I guess similar to what Stuart was saying earlier, that there are very large cultural differences and political differences across the world. So we probably won't have consensus around the adherence to socialist values. But my sense, and Stuart will have more sort of direct evidence from these conversations. But I think, yeah, just as with other very dangerous, potentially very dangerous technology in the past, I think there can be some minimal consensus. But yeah, my best bet will be that just takes a little longer. Hopefully not too long, and hopefully we'll have the time. But I think, yeah, that's an extra direction, maybe like beyond the things we're currently focused on for 2025.
So much, Daniel. Stuart.
I said a lot already, so I'm trying not to go on too long. An example of something I think where we could get global agreement would be that we have a right to know if we're interacting with a human or a machine. I've yet to find someone who thinks we shouldn't have that right. And I think it is important. It's a line that we can draw in the sand on behalf of the human race. And it obviously prevents all kinds of deception and so on. But I think it would be something that if governments could agree on one thing and do it soon, it's already in the European Union AI Act. And Singapore, I think, is bringing it in their labeling legislation. And, think about traffic lights, right? Everywhere in the world, says red means stop, as far as I know. I've yet to be in a country where red didn't mean stop and green did not mean go. There's some dispute about what yellow means. And that's incredibly valuable, right? And so I think in labeling of content, something similar to that, so it's not, a little thing in a tiny font in the bottom right corner that says, artificially generated. It's something that's immediately cognitively obvious. You don't have to think am I looking at something real or not? You don't have to take the video and run it through some recognizer software before you can know if it's safe to look at, and so on. So that would be something good to do. And I think we fail to appreciate actually how much value we derive from things. We just take them completely for granted until they're taken away. So for example, have you ever wondered about why it is that when you put an American postage stamp or an Irish postage stamp on a letter and you address it to another country, people in that other country spend their labor and their petrol driving the trucks and so on to deliver a letter when it has stamps on from another country? What on earth is that about? Right? Since when would that make sense? Well, since 1859, when they set up the Universal Postal Union and all the countries in the world agreed that we would respect each other's postage. And it wasn't until our president-elect in his last administration actually said, no, we're pulling out, right, on the grounds that somehow this is an infringement on American sovereignty, that we have to respect postage stamps from foreign countries, right? And then you realize, oh my goodness, right? Someone went to all that effort to get that into place, and how wonderful it is when you think about it that happens. And so we need to do the same kinds of things with AI, and I think we will gradually realize that there's all kinds of things we should come to expect. And the first one is knowing whether you're even interacting with an AI system, but there will be lots more.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Stuart. Sara, please.
Okay. I don't know if I said it. I think there will be or won't because I forget what I said. So maybe it wasn't that, but I do think that there will be some global standards. I think to your point, I fail to see a world where everybody has the same regulation, but exactly, but that's neither here nor there. I think one area beyond sort of safety that we will see is industries grappling with AI and how either regulators or policymakers that have expertise in certain industries sort of layer on top of this. And I don't think that it is fair to have one office in every country sort of oversee everything. I think it is perfectly reasonable to believe that the FAA in the United States would reasonably understand how AI is being used in airplanes, airplane manufacturing, airplane flying. I think it is reasonable to believe that the folks that sort of regulate our medical fields across the board, from doctors all the way to drugs, would gain an expertise in this area and understand usage in their domain. And so I think while we're all talking about safety, and that's really important, and that's sort of the foundation and the floor, we are going to need AI experts and technical experts across fields in a way that I think we are just at the beginning of right now.
Yeah, to keep it short, there's a few areas I mentioned earlier, right? And so in healthcare, we're looking at, and so I passed the Physician Makes Decisions Act, right? Because it was an issue with people using algorithms insurance companies using algorithms to deny care, or in education, we want to look at say, hey, what are the positive uses or things we should be on the lookout for. So I think we will find areas across different industries. And again, partly this depends also how broadly you define AI, right? Is it just machine learning or natural? I ran a company that was doing openness and transparency for law that spun out of Stanford Law School. And, we used machine learning, really natural language processing to go through millions of lawsuits and extract out information and structure that so people could, do queries that they could never do before. And at the time we used to say, what are the areas relatively untouched by big data? That was the term. We used big data. And it was law, healthcare, and government. And so those were also some of the opportunity areas that we could hopefully have more insight into, and better customer experience, better, more information, more data. So again, I think it's going to be, I think there is room for an answer to your question, and it'll be specific in different industries.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our amazing panel. I want to give them all a round of applause. It's a long session. Now, question time. So I think we'll take some questions from the room. If there are some, and then I think Joanna will turn to the virtual.
Hi, everyone. Well, my name is Nicolas Miai. I'm the CEO of Prism Eval, one of these Europe-based testing and evaluation private sector organization working on general-purpose systems. The question is I was about to build upon your question and ask whether, besides China, we should also engage Russia, but then I said, no, not a good one. I was about to ask about why Elon Musk endorsed actually SB 1047. And I said, no, that's not a good one. And I landed on something more appropriate, which is building upon your point earlier, Lucilla, about how the code of practice, in your opinion, is going to deal with the G7 code of conduct, which is also coming, and consolidate with the voluntary sets of commitments that is coming out of the Bleach-Deepak process. For people like us trying to build standards of evaluation and testing, for example, but there are other people doing other great things to leverage these new self and hard regulatory norms. It's at times difficult to see where this is going. The only binding legal base that we have right now that we are going to have is yours, basically is the code of practices. So what is your perspective over the convergence at the global level, though G7 is not global, it's partially global, how these two are going to combine? One thing is that one could dilute the other, one could actually reinforce the other. Where do you stand on that?
Well, thanks for this question. Now, the things are quite different. If you take the voluntary commitments of the G7 or also the way they were refined at the Seoul summit, they're much more generic than the obligations in the AI Act. So what the AI Act gives us is the possibility to identify in the code of practice specific steps to take. So identify, as I said, the risk, identify the way of assessing this risk, and then, if possible, the mitigation measures. So I think that the AI Act is a bit more precise in this sense, and so I expect the code of practice to have an outcome that is a bit more precise, and this will help the implementation also of these voluntary commitments. Now, the AI Act is fully consistent with the Hiroshima process. We have, a part of the G7, and so we've worked very closely with the colleagues of the G7 to make sure that the two approaches were consistent, because the AI Act was already being passed, and so it was important that everything was consistent. And the Seoul commitments are then built on the Hiroshima and so on. And so I find all these approaches consistent with each other. Now, the regulation, of course, is mandatory. And I expect the code of practice to come forward with specific measures that will have to be taken. And then this is going to be an important force for alignment for the future.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Benjamin Larsen, AI lead at the World Economic Forum. So my question goes back to this earlier conversation about hypothetical risks on one side versus scientific risks that we're currently seeing on the other side. And I know Stuart and Daniel, you've both touched on it a little bit, but would be very keen to hear from you, Sara and Lucilla, in terms of how do you see this? What is a good institutional mechanism? What are good organizational approaches that take both risks into considerations that are very relevant today, that we can benchmark against, that we can scientifically test and prove for, versus hypothetical risks that could be true in a year, in a few years from now? Stuart, again, you mentioned AGI possibly before the end of the decade. But what does this look like, practically speaking? How should we think about it today at this intersection between present and future hypotheticals? Thank you.
I mean, I think it sort of depends on how you define hypothetical risks. I think CBRN is an area that I guess you may define as hypothetical because the models can't do it yet, but we have very clear thresholds in our RSP about when we would deploy or not deploy based on sort of a standard of risks assessment. So I think that there are a lot of what I would call scenario-based risk. And I think this is where, to steal from the current codes of practice, things like persuasion, misinformation, bias, those are important risks. You all have defined them as systemic risks. I think we could say that. But it's very scenario dependent and oftentimes has a political bent. And so I think creating thresholds for things like that are also quite difficult. And then I think you have things in the middle, like cyber, where we do huge amounts of testing for that, but there is also some scenario situations that would perhaps change thresholds. So it's like we want the evaluation to be science, and I think the thinking about the potential risks to maybe be art and science.
So, what we're doing now about the, as you call it, hypothetical. I'll come back to this hypothetical versus scientific, because I think that's slightly misleading dichotomy. So what we're doing right now is we're looking at early warning signs of autonomy or sort of AGI-like risks. So the ability of a system to replicate itself without any direction from a human. And we are certainly seeing signs of that capability. And computer viruses have done that for decades. So it's not you could say it's not a hypothetical risk. It's actually quite plausible and a real thing that could happen. But I wanted to go back to the 1940s when in the Manhattan Project, they were developing nuclear weapons. And someone pointed out something that I don't know whether you would call it a hypothetical or a scientific risk, but a potential risk that that exploding a nuclear weapon would actually create a chain reaction among the nitrogen atoms in the atmosphere, and you would have a nuclear explosion of the entire atmosphere, which would end human life within seconds. And so they took that question seriously. They did the calculations, and they found that, in fact, yes, it could happen, not with the bombs that they were building. And I mean, it's interesting. You read the original TypeScript. It says, we have a margin of safety of a factor of 2 in some of the necessary reaction cross sections, right? And they said, look, if we build a bomb this big, which is a lot bigger than the one they were building, then there would be a chain reaction of the atmosphere and human life would end. And so they put the capability threshold, as it were, and said, we're going to stay way below that capability threshold because it would be crazy to cross it. And so this is the kind of analysis that we need to do and we're not doing with AI systems. And if the risk is extinction, as and don't ask me, right? Ask the CEOs of the companies. They say the risk is extinction. They put the probability, if they succeed in creating AGI, the risk of extinction vary, depending on who you ask, 10, 15, 25, or 30%. So if you take them at face value, and their claims that they will reach AGI before the end of this decade, then that's sort of the equivalent of building a bomb bigger than the threshold that would ignite the atmosphere. Just saying.
Lucilla, I think.
We have time maybe for one more. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Ilona. I've heard the possibility of restricting access to high performance compute as potential federal legislation. So I guess this question is more directed at like Senator Becker and maybe Professor Russ. What do you think the feasibility is that even consider limiting access to high performance compute to train and build models before we reach AGI to give us more time to create more comprehensive legislation?
I'll be interested to hear what the professor says. I don't see us going in that direction, and certainly not. I don't think we've been headed. You know, one of the parts of 1047 that was universally, I think, people liked was the idea of public compute, right? So can you have a public compute so that academics and others could do some of this research themselves outside of the private model? So that's sort of the direction that's been heading at from my knowledge. I'm curious, you.
So I think it's a great question, and there are many related questions around hardware, right? We've got the geopolitical battle over access to high-end chips and trying to restrict that for some of our competitors. We've got a concept called hardware-enabled governance, which is something that we actually have been using for a long time with digital rights management. So certain hardware manufacturers agreed to make it difficult or impossible to run pirated video, and to, you know, you can't run European videos if you're in the US and vice versa, and so on. So hardware-enabled governance, if we have things that we want to ensure, like you know, above a certain threshold of capability of AI system, you can only run it if it's appropriately authorized or licensed. The hardware can implement that governance mechanism. You can have geofenced chips that won't run if they're not in the place where they were authorized to be, and so on. So all of that is quite interesting, particularly from the point of view of preventing misuse or deployment of unsafe AI systems by non-state actors, let's say. So as to the question, you know, would we even consider, well, it depends on what we think the risks are. We do consider limiting access to enriched uranium, for example. We don't encourage open source uranium enrichment, for example. And I think this is an important point. The open source movement often views this as just kind of fundamental religious principle that open source is good, period. End of discussion, right? And then you ask, well, how do you feel about open source uranium enrichment? And they say, oh, well, we didn't mean it was good in all cases, just the ones we want, right? And so, you know, is AI and the compute necessary to run it more like enriched uranium, or more like, I don't know, clean water or something? We'll have to see. It may be that we come up with ways of designing AI systems that are guaranteed to be safe, in which case there's no risk in allowing people to build and deploy that on whatever scale they want. So there's if you need another incentive to work on guaranteed safe AI systems, there it is.
I think you could probably all hear my whisper there. Thank you so much, everybody, for those questions in the room. I want to thank the panelists, and I want to leave them all with an opportunity to give us a closing remark, a key takeaway, something to leave with you over the weekend as we approach Thanksgiving. Senator, I'm going to start with you.
I'll just say, stay tuned.
Maybe I will just say I'm grateful for the number of people that are working on this day in and day out, even when we don't always agree, because I think it's really important.
Yeah, I'm much more optimistic than I was a couple of years ago. Because of the work being done by governments, by companies, even by the media, who I often disagree with, but And it's interesting to see the level of public awareness of these questions, and public opinion is quite cautious on a lot of these issues.
I'm going to shamelessly use this for advertising. So my closing message is keep an eye out for the International Scientific Report on the Safety of Advanced AI, which will come out soon. And I think it should be of interest to anybody who's thinking about different kinds of risks and how well evidenced are they and how relevant are they. And then there's another thing that will come out soon as well. Maybe Lucilla is going to talk about.
In fact, I was taking the opportunity to to follow you on the publicity side and say, stay tuned on the code of practice. So if you are a member of the code of practice, do reply. We are expecting your input until the end of the month, but please continue following it. We are very grateful to have such a large community, and that, you know, we have more than 1,000 people joining the code of practice, which goes back to what we were saying earlier. There is so much interest, and I think it's important that the public is aware, and it's important that more and more people get involved in the discussion and in the technicalities of the discussion, because we need more and more experts. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to our panel, to our audience, to the folks that have tuned in, including the delegation here today.
And thank you so much to our fantastic moderator. Thank you to